Today I'll be doing a review of one of the newer watches from Baltic. It's part of their dressier watch range, the Baltic Prismic. As a note, this watch was lent into the channel by a good friend, so thank you very much. You know who you are. I appreciate it. But other than that, it's a pretty decent watch. It has some flaws, absolutely, but let's just take a closer look. So we have a diameter of 36 millimeters, lug to lug of 43.3, height of 9 millimeters, a lug width of 20 millimeters. Some other general specifications for the watch, we're gonna have the ETA 7001 hand wind movement beating away in here. Just the very classic striping and blued screws that you typically see with this movement at this price point. We do have 30 meters of stated water resistance with just a regular push-pull crown. Baltic uses a double dome sapphire crystal with inner AR coating, which is always nice to see. An interesting point about this case is it is mainly 316L, but the mid case itself is actually made of titanium. Whether or not that really is functionally useful or just they did it because they can, who knows, but it is there. And really, last but not least, this retails directly from Baltic for 1050 euros, which roughly converts to about 1150 US dollars. So starting off with the dial here, and I think Baltic did a beautiful job, and there's really just a lot of detail going on here. We have these what I would call pyramidal hour markers for most of the markers themselves. At the 3, 6, 9, and 12, we have these more, I guess you can call them kind of the triangular prism kind of mark. It has somewhat of a rectangular but also triangular shape to it, so I think that's the closest shape we're going to get to what it actually is. They are all multifaceted, which gives this beautiful light play that you can see as you move around the watch, just depending on the angle you're looking at it. And it's nice because the watch is never really completely black. We have this center guilloche pattern, which pretty much is just a stamped guilloche, but it radiates out from the center and has a nice look about it. We then have a circular brush hours track and then a more defined metallic seconds track there, which actually is grained on the inner portion of that sub-seconds. Lots of detail, lots of finishing going on, really just lots to take in, and in my opinion there is almost too much at some points. I do think the fact that we have really 3 base textures going on, the brushing, the guilloche, and the graining, it can be a little dramatic at times, especially because we have markers that are so poppy, so in your face, so intense, that your eye doesn't almost know where to pay attention to. There's almost too much going on, a little bit of an overload of the senses in a sense. We do have beautiful Dauphine style hands here. They are polished on the edges, or they have anglage on the edges to give a little bit of a contrast to the actual brushing of that hand, add a little bit more legibility. I think just tie in better with the rest of the dial as well, because you have so many shiny elements. Had they gone for fully brushed hands, I don't think it would have been a great look, but they balanced it well here. I like that they kept the text really minimal here. We just have Baltic at 12, no other text, no fact that it says hand wound, it doesn't say Swiss movement, it doesn't say, you know, Prismic, which is the model name. It doesn't say anything other than Baltic, and that's all we really need to know. If there's any other info you want us to know, it's on the case back, it's accessible in France, yada yada. But we just need to know what your brand is and let the watch design speak for itself, which is what this watch does, and I enjoy that. One thing I really will commend Baltic on, other than these beautiful, indices that have a lot of light play to them, is the color depth of the dial and the way the color kind of shifts. You do have a almost dual nature about this guilloche, where sometimes it is a darker color, sometimes it is a lighter color, and that's played off beautifully in the brushing sections too, because typically any kind of brush surface has this light play to it, where you have these lighter sections of the color contrasted by the darker, and as you move it around and those brush sections hit the light, you get a different color to pop out. Thankfully, this watch isn't just one note, boring, the same thing in every lighting situation. It does have some depth and some life to it. Taking a look in natural light, we can see it takes on a lot of the darker tones of that purple dial overall. Of course, the markers are popping beautifully. I love that at every angle there is a little bit of light play. They're never completely silver, never completely blackened. There's always something interesting going on in the dial, whether it be the actual guilloche popping at you, whether it be the markers. There are just a lot of beautiful things to look at, and thankfully so. It looks good. Right now it's more of an overcast lighting than true shaded lighting, but that's pretty much the perfect lighting for a watch anyway, so you get an idea of how the watch can shift and can draw in the light. Looking in more direct sunlight, surprisingly you still do get some play from those markers due to that multifaceting. Even in direct harsh sunlight, you're getting some angles where those markers are black and some when they are shining, which is nice to see. Of course, you're getting a lot more of that true sunray finish that's popping out, a lot of those brighter purple tones that are popping out at you, and you can see a lot more of all the details that really Baltic has put into the watch and all the layers that are on this dial. So zooming in here, we can see there is a lot of beautiful detail on display display here. Again, you have this multi-layer dial with that guilloche base, which is the lowest portion of the dial itself. You have this raised brushed seconds track, which also has this beautiful tiny lip down following into that base guilloche pattern. You have the grained sub-seconds track with this metallic outer actual track for the seconds. And it all, I think, looks pretty good. Of course, when we're looking under macro, it isn't the best QC'd. We see a lot of dust and kind of particles on pretty much every metal applied surface here. The edge of the handset is just really rough there for the minute's hand. The hour hand, a little bit better, to be honest, is pretty well cut. Going on to the indices, those are really dusty. So this, I would say, is probably a little bit more unacceptable for QC, especially with the fact that if you go to every single index, it's pretty much the same story, if not worse. So that's something where I think they could tighten up on. To be fair, again, these aren't things you notice from wrist. It does kind of quote unquote shine back at you perfectly, but like this index, probably one of the cleaner ones, and if they were all like this, I wouldn't complain as much. But there are some really, really rough ones here, like that one. It should not be on the watch, you know, at least in my opinion. Definitely are spots where they need to up their QC, up their little standards here, especially if you're going for multifaceted markers, which are this uniquely shaped and this large relatively. You want them to shine, you want them to be pretty, you want them to be kind of a point of your watch, something that is drawing people to your design. And if this is the standard you're leaving it to, I think you can strive for something a little bit better, especially when you're charging over $1,000. So despite the relative dirtiness of the applied metal portions, the rest of the dial is done fantastically. The brushing is done, I would say, pretty well. I love the fact that the guilloche expands beyond this brushed hours track and goes to the very edge of the dial. It just has that little bit of continuity to it. The actual depth of that pattern continues to grow towards the outboard, so you get a little bit of life there. Again, the grain seconds track doesn't do much for me. I do prefer it to them having done a sunburst or something like that. So, kudos to them for doing something different and really not drawing your eye away from the rest of the dial, because it is a very matte texture that we have here for the seconds track. We also do have a center pinion cap for the hand stack, which is always nice to see. Not something I see a lot in watches, and I think it's pretty welcome when I do see it. And surprisingly, that is probably the best of the metal applied elements, the little center pinion there. Hey, at least they did something well. Like the printing is done, nothing to write home about, but it is done, I think, in a way that integrates nicely into the texture without ruining the depth of the texture. But it is still very basic relatively, but I think that's okay because it lets the rest of the dial shine. Pretty decent detail under macro, but definitely places they can tighten it up. So moving on to the case of this watch, and this is what I think lets down the watch the most, at least just in my opinion. It is a relatively simple, and I think they try to go for a lot of kind of elements of architecture and lots of elements of like multi-part case construction, but to me it just ends up feeling a little bit lackluster and a little bit too dainty in a lot of the elements they went for. Kind of just looking more generally at first, we do absolutely have a mix of polish and brush. You can even see we have a two-layer, two-stepped bezel here. The first layer here is circular brush, the second layer is polish, then it leads to the crystal. We have these lugs which are kind of joined into the case and they almost seem segmented from the case itself, and these are done in full high polish. Looking at the mid case, we have high polish there on the case back, high polish on the side of that still high polished bezel, brushing on the sides of the lugs, which I think is an interesting touch, and then that titanium mid case that we were talking about earlier, which has this more blasted titanium finish to it. What I do love is because of the construction of this case, you do get a relatively just thin feeling case overall. They mentioned it's about 7.4 millimeters without that domed crystal, and it does feel thin. It feels nice on wrist. I think they did a weird thing here where the top and bottom portions aren't really angled in any way, so it doesn't visually thin out the watch any more than it would had it just been a brushed surface really. On top of that, when you have the largest portions of that middle case being completely brushed and being so matte that it's not reflecting any light, it kind of draws your eye in and makes you focus on that point more. Thankfully, this mid-case titanium part is relatively thin, but then it just like kind of focuses your eye there, and then you see how it's sandwiched, and to me it doesn't feel that premium. I do love the fact that they put drilled lug holes here. I like that they went with a curvature in the lugs, or really an angling down of the lugs, even though it is a relatively thin case already. But just to me, when you're looking at it from the top view, you see like a little bit of a segmentation here in the lugs where they attach to the case. The thinness of the bezel and the two steps to it is not too badly done in my opinion, but when you have it on wrist, it has a stance which I guess would say it doesn't feel confident within itself. It feels almost too delicate, and you have a lot of boldness going on with the dial with so much almost heavy furniture on the dial. The case doesn't feel like it almost supports that in a way. There's almost too much going on with the case and too much going on with the dial, and I think a more simplistic, almost even slightly blockier case shape would have helped a little bit more, maybe more defined, thicker lugs, maybe a more rounded, almost like cow horn shaped lug here would have worked a little bit better. But as it is, it's not bad, but it feels like a very almost generic case, which just is, right? It's nothing overly special to me. I do like how they went with a relatively small crown. You can see it is really not large by any means, but it does have a really nice knurling on it, so you can grip it pretty well. You can wind it pretty easily. This is of course a manual wind watch, so you're gonna have to be doing that. It has a nice feel to the winding. You can kind of pull it out pretty easily. There's a little bit of a kind of space there, a notch there in the back of the case for you to grasp onto. The actual hand setting is pretty good, really smooth, nothing really wrong there. It is a pretty quality feeling movement in operation. And because I haven't mentioned it before, this is not a hacking seconds watch. And then just to touch on this bracelet for a second, Baltic considers this their braided bracelet. I'm not a huge fan of it. Aesthetically, I do think it's awesome. You can just tell this has a little bit more unique of a grain than a typical mesh bracelet does. Very much more reminiscent of vintage bracelets where they actually had artisans craft just the bracelet for the watch. It felt a little bit more bespoke. It felt a little bit more artistic, and this has that flair about it. My main issue comes from the fact that there is negative articulation in this bracelet, or realistically, it bows out so far from the case. And I don't overly understand why. I feel like they could have made this a very fluid bracelet here at the end links, but they just didn't. This is increasing the overall length of the watch to 56.4. It doesn't wear like that necessarily. That's almost, that's like larger than a 42mm Pelagos. But what it does do is, one, if you have a very small wrist, obviously it's not going to conform to you very well. But two, even if you have a wrist that suits this, there is just so much like visual heft to me created from like the bump on both ends of this bracelet that it doesn't feel elegant. It doesn't feel homogeneous with the design. It's almost like they almost nailed it, but they just did something that wrong, and this is what they did wrong. The clasp of this is also a little bit hard to function. You kind of open it up here, you feed it through, and then you clasp it shut. It has like a hidden tail, which I do like, and it makes it easy on wrist. But the problem is, it's not super intuitive to put on and off because you're kind of fumbling with it. Let me show you, for example. I'll just do that in a second. Really quickly, to just finish off this portion, we have, of course, the signed Baltic logo on the clasp there, and then we do have quick release spring bars on the back. And again, just the case back that I showed earlier, which is some general text along the outside. It's assembled in France, the ETA movement, water resistant, yada, yada, yada. So anyway, moving on to how this watch wears, and realistically how getting the watch bracelet on the wrist happens. A quick side first, I was wearing this very fun D1 Milano. For note, this is an integrated watch at 37, so I mean, it almost visually feels more like a 39mm watch, so keep that in mind for visual comparison to this. And then when we put the Baltic on, of course, we drape it over the wrist, whatever. But when you turn it over, you have to then feed this end into the other end of the buckle here and kind of just feed it, feed it, feed it, feed it. And it just is not a fluid and intuitive motion for the most part. I do like it has an almost like infinite adjustability to it, which is cool. It will fit pretty much any wrist, and it's much better, I think, than most traditional like Milanese style straps. But I don't know, I'm just not in love with the feel of getting it on and off. I guess there are maybe just trade-offs you have to deal with, but the fact that the trade-off is it's hard to get on and it bows out in a weird way that I just don't like. It's like too many trade-offs for me. You can see it bows out like a little bit past where my arm ends. So again, it's not articulating and conforming perfectly to my wrist. It's almost If I can get a good angle, it's almost rising up above the wrist a little bit. So it is just one of those things where I don't think this is a perfect execution of this bracelet style. I do think it kind of like looks pretty good in still images and kind of top-down view portions, but when I look at it on myself in person, there's something off about it. I just do think it's the lack of conforming around these end links. That all aside, it is a well-fitting case. Of course, we're going and looking at 36 millimeters here. It's a perfect classical dress watch proportion. It's not thick at all, so it wears pretty comfortably on wrist. You have a lot of dial depth here, so it doesn't feel big because what little height you have is being taken up by other elements of the watch. It is well done. It is a good proportion. I don't think they can do much to improve the wearability outside of making some maybe domage to the bezel here, you know, kind of anglaging away at some of the angles here on the sides. But that is more subtle details that you're probably not going to end up noticing in the end. Whereas what they have here, I think, is a decent package. It just is a case that doesn't blow my mind. It doesn't feel perfect overall. The bracelet is cool, and I do like the fact that they went for a brushed finish to the bracelet rather than a full high polish. I think that would have been just way too much, especially on this you know, super complicated, super shiny watch dial. Then again, had they done an all polished version, would I like it? Probably. But you know, that aside, it kind of draws attention away from the bracelet and makes it a little bit more static and draws your attention to the watch, which I think, or at least watch face, which I think is the most important part here. Looking at it from a side view and kind of pulling the bracelet down onto my wrist, you can see it has the potential to conform well on the wrist, especially as you're flexing it. Again, the case shape doesn't really rise up off the wrist. As you're flexing it, the bracelet does conform at points. But again, when you're just kind of like standing day to day, I have like terrible camera angle for this. But you can just see, again, it's not conforming the way you would want it to necessarily. The bracelet can be improved 100%. And if for some reason they can't improve the structure of this bracelet for whatever reason, this is not the bracelet for this watch, or make it a straight end link or something like that. Because I like the idea of it, I like the aesthetic of it, but if you don't have a huge wrist, it's not right, I don't think. Taking a look at the strap, I believe this comes as an added on option. You can either get it ordered on the strap, ordered on the bracelet, or order both together, of course. The strap's nothing really to write home about. It's decent. I like the kind of flat grain to it. It's not really in your face. It's pretty much unpadded, which I like. It makes it very comfortable. Quick release spring bars. It has a little bit of curvature to it, which I do hate curved spring bar straps, so that predisposes me not to like this strap. But otherwise, I do love the geometricness of this buckle here. This is pretty cool. One of the better buckles I've seen. To be fair, the buckle is done better than the actual case shape, so you know, take that for what you will. The strap is comfortable, it's serviceable, and unless you have a wrist that's probably, you know, let's say 7.5-inch wrist or up, you probably want to go for the strap or the bracelet, because again, I don't think the bracelet will fit you overly well. Taking a look at the strap on wrist, it's all right. I don't like it. Black and purple, it's okay. It's not something that I would necessarily go for automatically. You could have honestly gone for a more unique neutral gray that would have looked a lot better as a standard strap option than this black. It's okay, it's serviceable, but it doesn't make the watch shine. It's honestly not the best quality strap on wrist. Now trying it on again, it honestly thins out, I think, too much towards the end here, and it feels almost flimsy and cardboardy in a sense, because you do have a good amount of padding here, and that's typically the amount I like. This is probably close to 2.5, maybe 3 millimeters. Taking my calipers, 2.5, look at me, I'm decently close. Yeah, so it starts at 2.5 here towards the top, thins out to way too thin here at the bottom. Let's see what we're talking about. Yeah, thins out to like 1.3 at the bottom. That's too much, man. So it's okay. To be fair, I would not order the bracelet. I wouldn't order the leather strap. If the leather strap by itself is an option, I would just do that to make the watch cheaper if you love the watch, and then get your own leather strap, because yeah, it's serviceable, but it will shine on pretty much anything else. So for example, this strap I'm about to put on starts at 2 millimeters, ends at 2 millimeters. So again, thinner strap overall, to be quite honest. It doesn't start at 2.5, but because it's more consistent, because it doesn't feel flimsy towards the end, it feels much better quality, and one, aesthetically, I think this looks way, 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 way better than the standard boring black strap. It adds a little bit of life and color to the dial, this almost grayish, taupish, brownish tone of the strap plays off some of these browner tones that can appear, these brighter, whiter tones that can appear when you're getting these light play off the indices. This is a much more interesting strap addition, a much more lively one, and one that I think makes the watch look a lot better. And also, straight end, which looks a lot better. I mean, I genuinely don't understand why most brands do curved end straps. I'll go on like a whole thing about that, so I'll just stop here and try this on. I believe this is called Swift Leather. It is made by Keepiece. They don't have it on the website, so you have to ask them to like custom make you one, but looks good. I think aesthetically matches really well with the watch. Very comfortable, a little bit more of a casual look, but again, it's still leather, so it's going to be dressier than putting it on rubber or putting it on a really bright and loud kind of strap or wearing a watch like this, you know. So, you know, especially to most people who mainly like sports watches, this will feel intensely dressy compared to that. So, you know, you have options. Now, unfortunately, I'm not in my normal space, so I don't have a lot of other straps on me. I technically do have this one, but it's a little bit thicker on the end, so there's not enough clearance to make this in there without me probably ruining the strap, which I've done before on some other ones, which I don't want to, you know, continue to do on these straps. So moving on to this strap, of course, classic white silicone. This is not by Archer. This is just a cheapy, like $2 one off of AliExpress. Does the job. Looks great on the watch. Bright, fun, poppy. Modernizes it, doesn't make it as dressy or as pinhole it into a dress category, I don't think. Supremely comfortable on the wrist. I mean, come on. I think that looks great. If you don't think that looks great, you're probably wrong, and it's okay to be wrong sometimes. This is, I think, a great combo, and it really plays off that purple amazingly well. When I move the watch up a little bit more, I have closer to a 6-inch wrist here. You can see, still have clearance on both sides. Still proportionally, I think, looks pretty good overall. It's a well-wearing watch, it's a well-wearing case. Just a case shape, not to my personal liking. I don't think it knocked it out of the park or anything. It's really the dial that is the star of the show here. And as long as you can get over how much is going on in the dial, it's fantastic. If you can't, I understand, because there's a lot going on here. So pros and cons of this Baltic here, and kind of just the first major pro for the watch, I think, is it is a very unique dial. These are markers that we have not really seen before, at least in modern watches, and I love the fact that they're included here. They have so much life, they have so much depth to them, and I think they just look really good on the watch overall. There's a beautiful depth of color to the watch. There is nice detail going on here. Absolutely, aesthetic can be preference, but I do think arguably this watch does look good for the most part. Another big pro for the watch is I do like how thin it is. It's a very comfortable wearing case. It's not overly long lug to lug. It doesn't feel awkward in terms of its normal proportions on the wrist, and they just did a good job with how it feels ergonomically. In general, I just want to commend Baltic for doing something a little bit different. They've done dress watches before, but I do think it was more of a risk of doing something not only at this price point, which is a little bit higher, you know, over $1,000, but making their kind of almost proprietary bracelet for this watch. Just doing something that not every brand is doing, not just ripping something off that already exists in a sense, and you know, trying something new. I don't think it was a perfect execution, but if they iterate, it can be a lot better, and I do think they're starting from a good template. So moving on to cons, and one of the biggest cons for me is going to be the bracelet. To be fair, you can get it on the strap instead. The strap is also bad, so you kind of can't win in that situation. Looking at the bracelet, I do think aesthetically it's awesome. I do like this braided pattern that they went with. It's very silky, it seems comfortable, it seems to conform well, but again, it bows out, it has an almost male end link stance, and it doesn't make sense. It doesn't look cohesive on the watch. It prevents it from wearing as good as it could, and it prevents it from being as comfortable, I think, as it could be. And realistically, honestly, if the end links were better, I probably wouldn't complain about the bracelet at all, even though it's weird to get on and off. Another con that I have with the watch is the case. I do think the case, they try to do, in a sense, too much, and they didn't execute it well. The stepped bezel is an interesting look for the watch, but I don't think it works perfectly here. You're taking a lot of kind of space away from the bezel itself. You're cutting it down and making it really look very thin, very fragile in a sense. The lugs themselves also very fragile, disconnected from the case a bit as well, and I don't think that aesthetic benefits the watch really in any way. It doesn't feel like a strong case. It doesn't feel like a case that complements the dial, and it does kind of feel like a cheaper, you know, I hesitate to say cheap, but it does feel like a cheaper kind of hodgepodge case in a sense. I'm not in love with it. It does fit very well. I do like the proportions of it, but aesthetically it's not my cup of tea. It might be, you know, good to some people, and if you do, it's a fantastic watch as a package then, but I do think the case lets the watch down a little bit. Had they gone for something more simplistic, something more rounded and softer and more monoblock in construction, something even more similar to like a Nomos style case, especially the Nomos Club range, that would have, I think, worked a lot better here. They tried to do too much at once. There's a lot going on the dial, there's a lot going on in the case, and it doesn't blend perfectly together in my opinion. And kind of following on from that point, there's too much going on here. There's a lot of texture and geometric shapes going on with the dial. Again, the case shape, there's a lot going on with, and I do think they kind of just threw everything through the kitchen sink at this watch in a sense, and they didn't focus and narrow down really on what aspects of the watch they want to shine. And the markers should really be the forefront of the watch, the most important part, the thing drawing your attention the most. But then you have this Geo shape pattern that jumps out at you sometimes and draws your attention away. And then you have you know, the case shape that really draws some of your attention at some other points. So I do think if they went with a more simplistic dial, maybe went with full brushing, maybe went with like a more lacquered type dial, it would have looked more elegant, it would have looked cleaner. And the fact that they used these super unique markers would have kind of been more impactful in the design, I think. But anyway, final thoughts. I'm not in love with the watch overall. I liked it aesthetically on first impression. When they released it, I thought it was very cool, but I think in person, not all the elements land perfectly, at least not to me. I'm very into dress watches and I'm not in love with this watch, so I think that says something about it. I think a lot of these design elements work and are beautiful in isolation, but when you put them together, it's not perfect. I think some of these points are kind of exemplified by the fact that their new release of this kind of watch range used all these stone dials, and they almost simplified everything. The markers are a little simpler. The stone dials were the thing doing the most talking, and I think that looks aesthetically a lot better overall. Is the case shape still the same case shape and still not great in my opinion? Yes. But at least they had a bigger focus and a more strong focus on one aspect of the dial. The fact that they didn't do the stone dials with all these crazy textures and then use the same kind of pyramidal markers scheme, obviously I think that was a good choice. Here, it's not a perfect representation of what the design could be. I do think it can get much better. I think as a line they should continue to kind of improve upon because it is relatively good value. This is going against things like Nomos and Fairer, not really much else that is using this ETA 7000 movement kind of around that price point that I can, you know, consciously bring up. But it's nice to have a thin dress watch option that is elegant, that is sub 40 millimeters, and that is around $1,000 because, again, like nothing really comes to mind. There's not a lot of options around that price point. I could be wrong. I could not be, you know, I don't know every watch in the world, but to me, they're not, you know, very readily available options because I don't even know about them. I guess overall, do I think this watch is worth the price? No, not necessarily. I do think as a whole, their micro order watch is a much better offering. It feels more cohesive with its own design. It wears just as well. It's basically half the price. And that I think is the best dress piece they have in their catalog at the moment. Can this be improved? Absolutely. Is it good as it is now? Not good enough to where I would say spend over $1,000 on it. If you can get this at around $700, $800 maybe, then it's pretty good value. But when we're talking full retail price, to me it's not worth it yet. Anyway, those are just my opinions, my thoughts, my ramblings for the most part. Thank you as always for watching the video. If you have something to say you have any questions, you have any opinions about the watch itself, please leave them down below. And yeah, that's all from me. Hope to see you in another one.